Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her Apache helicopter as the desert wind buffeted the aircraft. The sun blazed overhead in the Afghan sky, turning the landscape below into a shimmering maze of brown and gold. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years now, but something felt different about today's patrol. Viper 1, this is base. We have reports of suspicious activity in Grid Sector 7 Alpha. Proceed with caution, crackled the voice through her headset. Sarah adjusted her helmet and glanced at her co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, who was busy scanning the terrain through his targeting system. They had flown together for 8 months, developing the kind of trust that kept pilots alive in hostile territory. Marcus was quiet but reliable, the perfect partner for someone as aggressive as Sarah. Copy that, base. Viper 1 proceeding to Sector 7 Alpha, Sarah responded, banking the helicopter toward the designated coordinates. The landscape below stretched endlessly, dotted with small villages and rocky outcroppings that could hide enemy fighters. Sarah had grown up in Montana, where the open spaces felt familiar, but this desert held secrets that could kill you. Every shadow, every building, every group of people could be a threat. As they approached the target area, Sarah noticed a small convoy of vehicles moving along a dirt road. 3 pickup trucks and what looked like a supply vehicle. Nothing immediately suspicious, but in this part of Afghanistan, appearances meant nothing. Marcus, what do you see down there? Sarah asked, hovering the Apache at a safe distance. Marcus studied the vehicles through his optics. Looks like civilians, but I'm seeing some unusual heat signatures from the back truck. Could be weapons or equipment. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts over the years. Something about the way the vehicles moved, the spacing between them, the fact that they were traveling on a rarely used road. It all felt wrong. She had seen enough ambushes to recognize the signs. Base, this is Viper 1. I'm seeing a convoy that doesn't match normal civilian patterns. Requesting permission to investigate closer. Negative, Viper 1. Maintain safe distance and observe only. We have intelligence suggesting increased insurgent activity in your area. Sarah frowned. Safe distance was relative when dealing with rocket-propelled grenades and surface-to-air missiles. She had lost friends who followed orders too carefully, and she had saved lives by trusting her gut when regulations said to wait. The convoy stopped near a cluster of buildings that looked abandoned from the air. Sarah watched as figures emerged from the vehicles and began unloading equipment. Even from their altitude, she could see the distinctive shapes of weapons being moved. Marcus, are you recording this? Everything's being transmitted back to base. They're definitely moving military equipment. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This was the moment that separated good pilots from dead ones. The decision to act or wait, to trust the rules or trust experience. She had been in situations like this before, where waiting for permission meant watching enemies escape or prepare attacks on American forces. Viper 1, we're tracking your feed. Maintain position and continue surveillance. But as Sarah watched, she saw something that changed everything. A group of children appeared from one of the buildings, running toward the convoy. At first she thought they might be in danger, but then she realized they were playing, laughing, running around the armed men like they knew them. Base, I'm seeing children in the area. This complicates things. Sarah had 2 children of her own back home in Montana, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Jake, who thought their mom was the coolest person in the world because she flew helicopters. She video called them every week, watching them grow up through a computer screen while she fought a war half a world away. The sight of the children below made her think about rules of engagement, about the difference between enemies and civilians, about the impossible choices that war forced on people like her. She had joined the military to protect people, not to make split-second decisions about who deserved to live or die. Marcus, what's your read on this situation? Honestly, I think we're looking at a weapons transfer. But with civilians in the area, we can't do anything about it. Classic insurgent tactic, use human shields. Sarah watched the scene unfold below. The men were clearly moving weapons and equipment, but the presence of children meant any aggressive action was off the table. Unless they posed an immediate threat to American forces, she would have to watch and report. Then everything changed. One of the men below pointed up at their helicopter and shouted something to the others. Sarah saw weapons being raised, the distinctive shape of an RPG launcher being prepared. The children scattered, running back toward the buildings as the men took defensive positions. Viper 1, we're seeing hostile intent from your position. You are cleared to engage if fired upon. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with combat. Her training took over, years of preparation condensing into split-second reactions. She began evasive maneuvers as Marcus prepared the helicopter's weapon systems. "Sarah, they're locking onto us," Marcus shouted. The desert landscape blurred as Sarah threw the Apache into a steep dive, using the terrain to break any potential missile lock. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at. In the air, with her hands on the controls and Marcus backing her up, she felt more confident than anywhere else in the world. Base. Viper 1 is taking evasive action. Multiple hostiles with anti-aircraft weapons confirmed. The radio crackled with responses from base and other aircraft in the area. But Sarah was already focused on survival. The men below had made their choice when they pointed weapons at her helicopter. Now she had to make hers. As she pulled the Apache up and over a ridge preparing for a tactical approach, Sarah thought about Emma and Jake. She thought about Marcus's wife, who was pregnant with their first child. She thought about all the soldiers on the ground who depended on air support to get home safely. The laughter of children still echoed in her mind, but now it was mixed with the sound of weapons being prepared and the steady thrum of rotor blades cutting through hostile air. The first rocket-propelled grenade screamed past Sarah's Apache, missing the tail rotor by less than 10 feet. The explosion against the cliff face behind them sent rocks tumbling down the mountainside as Sarah banked hard left, using the natural terrain as cover. "Holy shit, that was close," Marcus yelled into his microphone, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the stress. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was too busy calculating angles, distances, and escape routes while keeping the helicopter stable. 3 years of combat flying had taught her that survival depended on staying ahead of the enemy's next move, not just reacting to their last one. Base, Viper 1 is under direct fire. I count at least 6 hostiles with RPGs and small arms. Requesting immediate backup. Viper 1, Cobra 2-3 is en route to your position. ETA 12 minutes. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours in a firefight. Sarah knew she had to neutralize the threat before more rockets found their mark. The Apache was tough, but it wasn't invincible. "Marcus, I need target acquisition on the RPG positions. Can you get me a lock?" "Working on it. They're using the buildings for cover, popping out to shoot then disappearing. Smart bastards." Sarah brought the helicopter around in a wide arc, staying low and using the rocky terrain to mask their approach. She had learned this tactic from an old instructor who had survived 3 tours in Iraq. "The ground is your friend," he used to say. "Use it like a shield." As they came around the ridge, Sarah could see the convoy more clearly. The vehicles had been positioned to create a defensive perimeter, and the men were using them as cover while they reloaded their weapons. But what caught her attention was something else entirely. More children had appeared, not just the few she had seen earlier, but dozens of them. They were emerging from buildings that she had thought were abandoned, running toward the sound of gunfire instead of away from it. Some looked curious, others frightened, but none of them seemed to understand the danger they were in. "Marcus, are you seeing this?" "Yeah, and I don't like it. Either these kids don't know what's happening or this whole thing is a setup." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Using children as human shields was nothing new in this war, but seeing it happen in real time never got easier. The men below knew exactly what they were doing. Every pilot in the theater had strict rules about civilian casualties, especially when children were involved. Another RPG launched from behind one of the vehicles, this time coming much closer to the Apache's main rotor. Sarah felt the helicopter shudder as shrapnel from the explosion peppered the armored hull. "Viper 1, your backup is still 8 minutes out. Can you maintain position?" Sarah looked down at the scene below. The armed men were becoming bolder, exposing themselves more as they realized the helicopter wasn't returning fire. The children were getting closer to the combat zone, drawn by curiosity or fear or the excitement that young people sometimes felt around danger. "Base, I have a problem. Multiple children in the immediate area, danger close to hostile positions. I cannot engage without risk of civilian casualties." "Understood, Viper 1. Continue evasive maneuvers and wait for backup." But Sarah knew that waiting might not be an option. She could see more men emerging from the buildings, carrying what looked like a larger missile system. If they got that operational, no amount of evasive flying would save her and Marcus. "Sarah, we need to do something," Marcus said quietly. "That looks like a Stinger missile system they're setting up." Sarah had faced Stinger missiles before, Unlike RPGs, which required skill and luck to hit a moving helicopter, Stingers were heat-seeking and almost impossible to evade once they locked on. If the enemy got that system operational, she and Marcus would have about 30 seconds to live. I know, but look at those kids. She watched as a group of children ran between the armed men and the missile system, playing some kind of game that involved chasing each other around the vehicles. They were laughing, their voices carrying up to the helicopter despite the distance and noise. Sarah thought about her own children again. Emma had laughed like that just last week during their video call, telling her mom about a game she had invented at school. The sound was the same, pure joy unmarked by the knowledge of how dangerous the world could be. Marcus, can you target just the missile system? Maybe we can take it out without risking the children. Marcus studied his targeting display. Maybe. It's a narrow window and I'd need them to move away from the launcher for at least 30 seconds. How long until they have it operational? Based on what I'm seeing, maybe 5 minutes. They know what they're doing. Sarah made a decision that went against everything in the Rules of Engagement handbook. She brought the Apache down lower, into the range of small arms fire, and activated the external loudspeaker system. This is the United States military, she announced in both English and the local dialect she had learned during her deployment. Clear the area immediately. You are in danger. The effect was immediate. The children stopped their game and looked up at the helicopter, pointing and chattering excitedly. But they didn't run away. If anything, they seemed more interested in the aircraft now that it was talking to them. The armed men, however, understood the message perfectly. Several of them raised AK-47 rifles and began firing at the Apache. Sarah heard the distinctive ping of bullets hitting armored surfaces as she pulled the helicopter back up to a safer altitude. Well, that didn't work, Marcus observed. No, but it bought us some information. Did you see how they reacted? The kids don't know they're in danger and the men don't care if they are. Sarah nodded grimly. She had hoped that announcing their presence would make the civilians scatter, giving her a clear shot at the missile system. Instead, it had only confirmed what she already suspected. The children were being used as human shields whether they knew it or not. Another RPG launched from the convoy, this time from a different position. Sarah saw it coming and dropped the Apache behind a rocky outcropping, just as the grenade exploded overhead. Viper 1, backup is still 6 minutes out. What's your status? Sarah looked at her fuel gauge, her ammunition counter, and the tactical display showing the positions of hostile forces. Then she looked down at the children below, still playing their game while men with weapons prepared to kill her. Base, I need to make a decision here. That Stinger system will be operational in less than 5 minutes. Viper 1, you are ordered to maintain safe distance until backup arrives. But Sarah knew that in less than 5 minutes, there might not be a Viper 1 to give orders to. Sarah watched through her targeting system as the men below worked frantically to complete the Stinger missile setup. Their movements were practiced and efficient. These weren't amateur fighters stumbling through unfamiliar equipment. They knew exactly what they were doing, which made them infinitely more dangerous. Marcus, I need options. We can't wait for backup and we can't shoot with those kids in the area. What if we try to separate them? Use the helicopter to herd the children away from the missile site? Sarah considered the idea. It was unconventional. Definitely not in any military manual, but desperate situations called for creative solutions. She had seen enough combat to know that sometimes the best tactics were the ones nobody had tried before. It's worth a shot. Better than sitting here waiting to get shot down. She brought the Apache around to approach from the north, staying low but moving slowly. Instead of the aggressive maneuvering she had been using to avoid enemy fire, she flew the helicopter in a steady, predictable pattern toward the area where the children were playing. The effect was exactly what she had hoped for. The children stopped their game and stared up at the approaching aircraft with wonder rather than fear. Several of them began waving, and she could hear their excited voices even over the sound of the rotors. It's working, Marcus observed. They're moving toward us and away from the weapons. But the armed men had noticed the change in tactics too. Several of them began shouting at the children, gesturing for them to get back behind the vehicles. Some of the older children seemed to understand and started moving back toward the convoy, but the younger ones were too fascinated by the helicopter to pay attention. Sarah made another decision that violated standard operating procedures. She activated the helicopter's external speakers again, But this time, instead of warnings, she played music. Marcus looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Sarah, what are you doing? Trust me." The music that came from the Apache speakers was a children's song from an American cartoon show, something cheerful and harmless that Emma and Jake loved to sing at home. Sarah had loaded it onto her personal device months ago to help her feel connected to her children during long deployments. The effect on the children below was immediate and dramatic. They began dancing and jumping, moving even further away from the convoy as they followed the source of the music. Some of the younger ones started singing along in broken English, words they had probably learned from television or aid workers. "This is either brilliant or completely insane," Marcus muttered. "Sometimes there's not much difference." The armed men were becoming increasingly agitated. Several of them left their positions to chase after the children, trying to force them back behind the vehicles. But children being children, the more the adults yelled, the more excited and defiant the young ones became. Sarah kept the Apache moving slowly, like a musical ice cream truck in the sky, drawing the children further and further away from the weapons. She could see that the men working on the Stinger system were becoming frustrated. They couldn't complete their setup with children running around the launch area. "Viper 1, what is your tactical situation? We're showing unusual movement patterns on your GPS." Sarah smiled grimly. "Base, I'm using unconventional tactics to separate civilians from hostile forces. Stand by. Viper 1, please clarify your methods." "You probably don't want to know, Base." Marcus suddenly tensed at his targeting display. "Sarah, they're moving the missile system," trying to relocate it away from the children. Sure enough, several men were attempting to carry the Stinger components to a new position behind one of the buildings. If they succeeded, they would have a clear shot at the Apache without any risk to the civilians. "Not going to happen," Sarah said firmly. She banked the helicopter sharply, cutting off the men's escape route and forcing them to take cover. At the same time, she increased the volume of the children's music, making sure every child in the area could hear it clearly. The tactical situation had become surreal. An American attack helicopter was essentially playing a game of musical chairs with insurgent fighters, using cartoon songs to manipulate the battlefield. Sarah knew that if she survived this mission, the after-action report was going to be very difficult to write. "Marcus, can you get a clear shot at the missile components now?" "Working on it. They dropped some of the equipment when they took cover. If I can target just the launcher assembly, do it." The Apache's 30mm chain gun fired a short, precise burst. The high-explosive rounds found their target, destroying the Stinger launcher in a spectacular explosion that sent metal fragments flying in all directions. The children cheered and clapped as if they were watching fireworks. "Target destroyed," Marcus reported with satisfaction. But their celebration was short-lived. The explosion had made the remaining fighters realize they were running out of options. Instead of trying to escape, they began setting up for a final desperate assault on the helicopter. "Sarah, they're regrouping. I count at least 8 men with RPGs taking positions around the perimeter." Sarah could see them too. They had abandoned any pretense of using the children as shields and were preparing for an all-out attack. This was the moment she had been dreading, when the tactical situation became simple and brutal. Base Viper 1 has eliminated the missile threat but is now facing coordinated RPG attack. Where is my backup? Cobra 2-3 is 3 minutes out. Can you maintain evasive action? 3 minutes was still too long, especially against multiple RPG positions. Sarah would have to use every trick she had learned to keep herself and Marcus alive until help arrived. "Marcus, we're going to have to get aggressive. No more games, no more music. These guys want to fight. I'm ready. Just tell me where you want the hurt put down." Sarah looked down at the children one more time. They were still dancing and singing, completely unaware that the adults around them were preparing for a battle that would probably kill some of them. Their laughter echoed up to the helicopter, innocent and joyful despite the violence surrounding them. "All right," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Let's show these bastards what an Apache can do." She pulled the helicopter into a steep climb, preparing for the kind of aggressive attack run that had made her one of the most feared pilots in the squadron. The time for games was over. Now it was time for war. The first RPG launched just as she reached the top of her climb, the grenade passing harmlessly beneath the Apache as Sarah rolled into her attack dive. Marcus already had targets locked, his finger on the trigger, waiting for her command. The children's laughter still echoed in her headphones, But now it was mixed with the sound of weapons charging and the steady beat of rotor blades cutting through hostile air. Sarah dove the Apache toward the convoy at maximum speed, using gravity and engine power to build velocity for the attack run. The desert floor rushed up to meet them as Marcus acquired targets through his advanced targeting system. 3 RPG positions were clearly visible, with fighters exposed as they prepared to fire. Target acquired. Left flank, Marcus called out. Take it. The chain gun roared to life, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the first RPG position. The fighter disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, his weapon spinning away across the desert floor. But even as they eliminated one threat, 2 more rockets launched from different positions. Sarah threw the Apache into a violent sideslip, using the helicopter's agility to avoid the incoming grenades. One passed so close she could see the fins spinning as it whistled past the cockpit. The other exploded against a rock formation behind them, showering the aircraft with stone fragments. Nice flying, Marcus said, already acquiring the next target. We're not done yet. Sarah could see more fighters emerging from buildings and vehicles, spreading out across the battlefield to make themselves harder to target. They were well-trained and disciplined, moving with the coordination of experienced soldiers rather than amateur insurgents. Viper 1, Cobra 2-3 is 90 seconds out. What's your tactical situation? Multiple hostile positions, well-coordinated enemy. Be advised there are still civilians in the area. Sarah banked the Apache around a cluster of rocks, using them as cover while she planned her next attack. Through her targeting system, she could see that the children had finally begun to understand the danger. Most of them were running toward the buildings, following the frantic gestures of women who had appeared in doorways. But not all of them were running to safety. A small group of children, maybe 5 or 6 years old, had become separated from the others during the chaos. They were standing in the middle of the open area, looking around frantically for their families. The sound of gunfire and explosions had finally penetrated their excitement about the helicopter, and now they were terrified. Marcus, do you see those kids in the open? Yeah, and so do the bad guys. 2 fighters are moving toward them. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She could see the fighters approaching the children, not to hurt them but to use them as human shields. If they reached those kids, Sarah would be unable to continue the attack without risking innocent lives. Not happening, she said grimly. Sarah pushed the Apache into another dive, this time directly toward the fighters approaching the children. She wasn't planning to shoot. The children were too close, but she could use the helicopter itself as a weapon. The Apache roared over the fighters at an altitude of less than 50 feet, the rotor wash from the main blades creating a massive dust storm that knocked both men to the ground. The noise was deafening, and the children scattered in all directions, finally finding the motivation to run toward the buildings. That was way too low, Marcus observed. But it worked. However, the low-altitude pass had exposed them to small arms fire from multiple positions. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of AK-47 rounds hitting the Apache's armored hull. Most of the bullets bounced off, but she could see warning lights starting to appear on her instrument panel. We've got some damage, Marcus reported. Hydraulic pressure is dropping on the secondary system. How bad? Manageable for now, but we can't take much more. Another RPG launched from a new position, this one better concealed behind a pile of supply crates. Sarah saw it coming and started evasive maneuvers, but the rocket was perfectly aimed. It was going to hit. At the last second, she threw the Apache into a move she had never attempted in combat, a full power slip that brought the helicopter almost to a complete stop in mid-air. The rocket passed inches in front of the nose, so close that she could feel the heat through the cockpit glass. Holy shit, Sarah. Where did you learn that move? Just made it up. But the extreme maneuver had consequences. The Apache shuddered and dropped toward the ground as Sarah fought to regain control. More warning lights appeared on the instrument panel and she could hear unusual sounds from the engines. Cobra 2-3, Viper 1 needs immediate assistance. We're taking heavy fire and have sustained damage. Viper 1, Cobra 2-3 has visual on your position. Coming in hot from the southeast. Sarah looked toward the horizon and saw the welcome sight of another Apache helicopter approaching at high speed. Cobra 2-3 was configured for ground attack, with full missile loadouts and an experienced crew that had been flying together for over a year. About time, Marcus muttered. But the arrival of reinforcements seemed to make the enemy fighters more desperate rather than less aggressive. Instead of trying to escape, they began a coordinated assault on both helicopters. RPGs launched from multiple positions simultaneously, creating a deadly crossfire that forced both aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers. Viper 1, we need to coordinate our attacks. Can you take the western positions while we handle the east? Roger that, Cobra 2-3. Sarah brought her damaged Apache around toward the western side of the convoy, where 3 fighters had taken positions behind vehicles. The hydraulic problems were getting worse, making the helicopter sluggish and difficult to control, but she could still fight. Marcus, target the vehicle on the left. The fighter is using it for cover. Got him locked. The chain gun fired again, this time targeting the engine block of a pickup truck. The vehicle exploded in a ball of flame and smoke, eliminating the fighter who had been hiding behind it. At the same time, Cobra 2-3 engaged targets on the eastern side with Hellfire missiles. The battlefield was rapidly turning in favor of the American forces. The enemy fighters were running out of covered positions and ammunition. Several of them began attempting to flee on foot, abandoning their weapons and vehicles. Base, this is Cobra 2-3. Hostile forces are attempting to withdraw, requesting permission to pursue. Negative, Cobra 2-3. Contain them but do not pursue beyond the immediate area. Viper 1, what's your status? Sarah checked her instruments. The hydraulic problems were getting worse and she could see fuel leaking from a punctured line. The Apache was still flyable but not for much longer. Base, Viper 1 has sustained moderate damage and needs to return to base for repairs. Roger, Viper 1. You're cleared to return. Cobra 2-3 will handle cleanup. As Sarah prepared to leave the battlefield, she took one last look at the area below. The children who had been playing and laughing just minutes before were now huddled in doorways with their families, watching the aftermath of the battle. Some of them were still looking up at the helicopters, but the wonder and excitement had been replaced by fear and confusion. Marcus, do you think they understand what just happened? I don't know. Maybe it's better if they don't. Sarah began the flight back to base, nursing the damaged Apache through the desert sky. Behind them, Cobra 2-3 continued to patrol the area, making sure no enemy fighters remained to threaten the civilian population. The sound of children's laughter still echoed in Sarah's memory, but now it was mixed with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. She wondered if those children would ever be able to play with the same innocent joy again, or if this day had changed them forever. As the base came into view on the horizon, Sarah realized that this mission had changed her too. The decision to use music and unconventional tactics had saved lives, but it had also shown her just how thin the line was between protecting innocents and putting them in danger. The war would continue, and there would be more missions, more difficult decisions, more moments when split-second choices meant the difference between life and death. But for now, she and Marcus were going home. 3 days after the convoy incident, Sarah sat in the debriefing room at Forward Operating Base Thunder, facing a panel of senior officers who looked less than pleased with her unconventional tactics. Colonel James Rodriguez, the base commander, had been reviewing her after-action report for the better part of an hour. Captain Mitchell, Colonel Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of military service. Your report mentions using children's music to manipulate civilian positions during combat operations. Can you explain the tactical reasoning behind this decision? Sarah had been dreading this moment since she landed her damaged Apache 3 days ago. Military protocol was clear about deviation from standard operating procedures, especially when civilian safety was involved. But she had also saved lives, both military and civilian, with her actions. Sir, the enemy was using children as human shields to prevent us from engaging their missile system. Standard tactics weren't working, and waiting for backup would have resulted in our aircraft being shot down. The music was an effective way to separate civilians from hostile forces, without causing harm to non-combatants. And you made this decision without consulting base command? There wasn't time, sir. The situation was developing rapidly, and I had to act based on the tactical situation on the ground. Major Patricia Hayes, the intelligence officer, leaned forward in her chair. Captain, your actions resulted in the destruction of a significant weapons cache and the elimination of a high-value target cell. However, your methods were unorthodox. Sarah nodded. She knew that her superiors were caught between recognizing her success and maintaining military discipline. The mission had been a tactical victory, but it had also raised questions about when pilots should deviate from established procedures. Lieutenant Chen, Colonel Rodriguez turned to Marcus. who had been sitting silently beside Sarah throughout the debriefing. "What's your assessment of Captain Mitchell's decisions during the engagement?" Marcus straightened in his chair. "Sir, Captain Mitchell's tactics were unconventional, but they were effective. We faced a tactically superior enemy position with civilians in the immediate area. Standard attack procedures would have resulted in civilian casualties and potentially the loss of our aircraft. Her decisions saved lives on both sides. And you supported these decisions in real time?" "Yes, sir. I trusted Captain Mitchell's judgment, and events proved that trust was justified." Colonel Rodriguez closed the file in front of him and looked directly at Sarah. "Captain, you've been flying combat missions for 3 years. Your record shows exceptional piloting skills and sound tactical judgment. This incident represents a departure from your usual by-the-book approach. What changed?" Sarah thought about the question for a moment. What had changed wasn't her skills or training, but her understanding of what the war meant to the people caught in the middle of it. Seeing those children laughing and playing while armed men prepared to kill her had crystallized something that had been building for months. "Sir, I think the war changed. Or maybe my understanding of it changed. We're not just fighting enemy soldiers anymore. We're operating in communities where the line between combatant and civilian isn't always clear. Sometimes standard tactics don't account for the human element." "The human element," Major Hayes repeated. "Can you elaborate on that?" "Those children weren't tactical considerations or potential casualties in a military operation. They were just kids playing a game. When I saw them laughing and dancing, I realized that protecting them required thinking beyond the procedures manual." Colonel Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. "Captain, your actions during this mission will be reviewed by higher command. In the meantime, you and Lieutenant Chen are grounded pending a full investigation." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Being grounded was often the first step toward a formal disciplinary action, or even a court-martial. After 3 years of successful combat operations, her career might be ending because she had tried to save children's lives. "Sir, how long will the investigation take?" "Unknown. Could be a week, could be a month. You'll remain on base and be available for additional questioning as needed." As they left the debriefing room, Marcus walked beside Sarah in silence until they were outside the administrative building. The Afghan sun was blazing overhead, turning the base into a shimmering maze of prefabricated buildings and defensive positions. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "I don't know. Maybe I should have just followed orders and waited for backup. And let those kids get used as human shields? Come on, Sarah. You know that wasn't an option." Sarah appreciated Marcus's support, but she also knew that military careers had been destroyed for less significant deviations from protocol. She had made a choice in the heat of combat, and now she would have to live with the consequences. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters writing an email to her children back in Montana. Emma and Jake were staying with their grandmother while Sarah was deployed, and the weekly video calls were the highlight of her time overseas. But tonight she struggled to find words that would explain why Mommy might be coming home early. "Dear Emma and Jake," she typed, then deleted the words and started over. "Hi, sweethearts. I hope you're having a good week at Grandma's house. I wanted to tell you about something that happened at work this week." She paused again. "How do you explain to an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old that you might lose your job for saving other children's lives? How do you tell them that sometimes doing the right thing can get you in trouble?" A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Marcus stood outside holding 2 cups of coffee and looking as tired as she felt. "Thought you might want some company," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Thanks. I was just trying to write to the kids." "What are you going to tell them?" "I have no idea." "How do you explain this situation to children?" Marcus sat down in the only other chair in the small room. "Maybe you tell them the truth, that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences even when they're the right ones. That's pretty heavy for a 5-year-old. Kids understand more than we give them credit for. Emma and Jake know their mom is a hero. This doesn't change that." Sarah looked at the half-written email on her laptop screen. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe honesty was better than trying to shield her children from the complexity of adult decisions. "Marcus, do you think we did the right thing?" "I know we did the right thing. The question is whether the military will see it that way. And if they don't, then we deal with whatever comes next. But Sarah, I want you to know that I'd make the same choice again. Those kids deserve better than being used as human shields." Sarah nodded, feeling some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Whatever happened with the investigation, She knew she had acted according to her conscience and her training. Sometimes that was all a soldier could do. Outside her window, she could hear the sound of helicopters taking off for night patrol missions. Other pilots were out there now, making the same kinds of split-second decisions that had landed her in this situation. She wondered if any of them would face similar choices, and whether they would have the courage to put innocent lives ahead of military protocol. The investigation would continue, and eventually, higher command would decide whether her actions were justified or whether she had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. But tonight she would finish her email to Emma and Jake, telling them about the day their mom learned that sometimes the hardest part of being a soldier wasn't fighting the enemy. It was fighting for what was right. 2 weeks into the investigation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hawkins, the regional commander responsible for all aviation operations in the theater, arrived at Forward Operating Base Thunder without advance notice. Her presence meant that Sarah's case had reached the highest levels of military command. "Captain Mitchell," General Hawkins said as Sarah reported to the base commander's office, "I've been reviewing your service record and the incident from 2 weeks ago. I wanted to speak with you personally before making any final decisions." Sarah stood at attention, unsure whether this meeting represented an opportunity or the end of her military career. General Hawkins was known throughout the service as a fair but demanding officer who expected excellence from everyone under her command. "At ease, Captain. Please sit down." General Hawkins was a small woman in her 50s, but her presence filled the room. She had started her career as a helicopter pilot herself, rising through the ranks during conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. If anyone would understand the pressures of combat decision-making, it would be her. "Captain, I've been a pilot for over 25 years. I've faced similar situations where standard procedures conflicted with immediate tactical realities. What interests me about your case is not what you did, but why you did it. Ma'am, your service record shows a pilot who has always followed procedures to the letter. Excellent technical skills, sound judgment, no disciplinary issues. Then suddenly you're playing children's music from a combat aircraft and using unconventional tactics. What changed?" Sarah had thought about this question every day since the incident. The answer wasn't simple, and she wasn't sure how to explain it to a general who would decide her professional future. "Ma'am, I think I finally understood what we're really fighting for over here. It's not just about eliminating enemy forces or completing missions. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Those children. Yes, ma'am. But not just them. All the civilians caught in this conflict. We talk about winning hearts and minds, but sometimes I think we forget that those hearts and minds belong to real people with families and dreams." General Hawkins nodded slowly. "Captain, I've read the intelligence reports from your mission. The weapons cache you destroyed was intended for an attack on a school in Kabul. Your actions prevented the deaths of potentially hundreds of children." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't known about the planned school attack, but it explained why the enemy fighters had been so well equipped and determined. "However," General Hawkins continued, "your methods raised serious questions about command authority and operational procedures. Military discipline exists for a reason, Captain. When pilots start making independent tactical decisions, it can lead to chaos." "I understand that, ma'am. But in that moment, following standard procedures would have resulted in civilian casualties and the loss of my aircraft. According to Lieutenant Chen's testimony, you made the decision to deviate from procedure before the situation became critical. You chose to prioritize civilian safety over military objectives." Sarah realized this was the crucial point of the investigation. Had she acted out of immediate necessity, or had she made a premeditated decision to ignore orders? The difference could determine whether she faced a commendation or a court-martial. "Ma'am, I made a tactical decision based on the evolving situation. The presence of children in the combat zone required adaptation of standard procedures. Captain, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. If you faced the exact same situation tomorrow, would you make the same choices?" Sarah looked directly into General Hawkins's eyes. This was the moment of truth, when her answer would define not only her future but her identity as a soldier. "Yes, ma'am, I would." General Hawkins was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. "That's what I thought you'd say, and that's exactly why I'm here." She opened a folder that had been sitting on the desk and pulled out several documents. Sarah could see official letterhead and multiple signatures, but couldn't read the specific contents. Captain Mitchell, effective immediately. You are being transferred to a new unit. The Special Operations Aviation Command is developing new tactical procedures for operations in complex civilian environments. They need experienced pilots who understand the importance of protecting non-combatants. Sarah felt confused. Ma'am, I don't understand. Am I being disciplined or promoted? You're being given an opportunity to help reshape how we conduct air operations in populated areas. Your unconventional thinking and willingness to prioritize civilian safety are exactly what this program needs. General Hawkins handed Sarah the transfer orders. You'll be working with a team of pilots, intelligence officers, and civilian experts to develop new rules of engagement for situations where enemy forces use human shields. Your experience will be invaluable. What about the investigation? The investigation concluded that your actions were tactically sound and morally justified. You saved civilian lives and completed your mission objective. However, it also highlighted the need for new procedures to handle similar situations. Sarah looked at the transfer orders, trying to process what was happening. Instead of being punished for her actions, she was being asked to help train other pilots to make similar decisions. Ma'am, when do I report to the new unit? Next month. You'll finish your current deployment here. Then report to Fort Rucker for 6 weeks of training before deploying with the Special Operations Team. As General Hawkins prepared to leave, she turned back to Sarah with something that might have been a smile. Captain, you did something 2 weeks ago that most pilots would never have the courage to attempt. You trusted your instincts and put innocent lives ahead of military protocol. That takes moral courage as well as tactical skill. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. Your new assignment will be much more challenging than anything you've faced here. You'll be operating in situations where the line between combatant and civilian is even more blurred than what you encountered with that convoy. After General Hawkins left, Sarah sat alone in the base commander's office trying to absorb what had just happened. Her career wasn't over. It was taking a completely new direction. Instead of being punished for thinking outside the box, she was being asked to help redesign the box itself. That evening, she called Emma and Jake for their weekly video chat. For the first time in 2 weeks, she had good news to share. Guess what, guys? Mommy is going to have a new job soon. Are you coming home? Emma asked excitedly. Not yet, sweetheart, but I'm going to be helping other pilots learn how to keep people safe, just like I try to keep you safe. Like the children in Afghanistan, Jake asked. Sarah had told them about the mission in general terms, focusing on how she had helped protect other children. Exactly like that. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices to protect people who can't protect themselves. As she talked with her children, Sarah realized that the sound of their laughter no longer carried the weight of memory from that day over the convoy. Instead, it reminded her of why she had made the choices she did, and why she would continue making them in her new role. The war would continue, and there would be more difficult decisions ahead. But now she would be part of an effort to ensure that other pilots had better tools and procedures for protecting innocent lives while completing their missions. Outside her window, she could hear the familiar sound of Apache helicopters returning from patrol. Soon she would be training the next generation of pilots to face the same impossible choices she had confronted. The laughter of children, both her own and those she had protected, would guide her in that mission. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of a classroom at Fort Rucker, Alabama, facing 12 of the most experienced Apache pilots in the United States Army. These were veterans of multiple combat deployments, men and women who had proven themselves in the most challenging environments the military could offer. Today, she would teach them something that couldn't be found in any manual. Good morning, Sarah began, looking at the faces that showed various degrees of skepticism and curiosity. I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell, and I'm here to talk to you about tactical flexibility in complex civilian environments. Major David Park, a pilot with 4 combat tours, raised his hand. Captain, we've all read the reports about your mission in Afghanistan. Using children's music from a combat aircraft? Some of us are wondering if this is really something we should be learning. Sarah had expected this question. The story of the convoy incident had spread throughout the aviation community, generating both admiration and criticism. Some pilots saw her actions as innovative thinking under pressure. Others viewed them as a dangerous departure from military discipline. Major Park, let me ask you a question. How many of you have faced situations where enemy forces used civilians as human shields? Every hand in the room went up. And how many of you were satisfied with the tactical options available to you in those situations? Not a single hand remained raised. That's why we're here, Sarah continued. Traditional air-to-ground tactics assume a clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants. But modern conflicts don't provide that clarity. We need new approaches that protect innocent lives while allowing us to complete our missions. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a pilot Sarah had flown with in Afghanistan, spoke up. Sarah, what you did worked in that specific situation. But how do we know these methods can be applied more broadly? Sarah clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing a map of recent military operations around the world. Red dots marked incidents where civilian casualties had resulted from airstrikes, while green dots showed successful missions where innovative tactics had protected non-combatants. Over the past year, Special Operations Aviation Command has tested modified procedures in 17 different scenarios. We've seen a 60% reduction in civilian casualties while maintaining mission effectiveness rates. She clicked to the next slide, showing video footage from a recent training exercise. An Apache helicopter was using loudspeakers and coordinated movements to separate civilians from hostile forces in a mock village. The techniques we're developing aren't just about playing music from helicopters. They're about understanding human psychology and using that knowledge to achieve tactical objectives. The room fell silent as the pilots watched the training footage. Sarah could see them beginning to understand that this wasn't about abandoning military discipline, but about expanding their toolkit for complex situations. Captain Mitchell asked Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson, the senior pilot in the group, "What about command authority? How do we maintain unit cohesion if every pilot starts making independent tactical decisions?" This was the most important question, and Sarah had spent months working with military lawyers and tactical experts to develop an answer. The new procedures include specific parameters for when pilots can deviate from standard tactics. It's not about ignoring orders. It's about having pre-approved alternatives for specific situations. She displayed a flowchart showing decision trees for various scenarios. The system provided pilots with options while maintaining command oversight and accountability. You still need authorization for any significant deviation from mission parameters. But now you have tools that didn't exist before, and commanders have better understanding of when those tools might be necessary. The training session continued for 3 hours, covering everything from psychological principles of crowd control to technical modifications of helicopter communication systems. The pilots asked tough questions and raised valid concerns about implementation and liability. During the lunch break, Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah privately. "Sarah, I have to ask, do you ever regret what you did that day? The investigation, the controversy, all the attention?" Sarah thought about the question while looking out the window at Apache helicopters conducting training flights. Young pilots were learning to fly the same aircraft she had used to protect those children in Afghanistan. "Lisa, I think about those kids every day. I wonder if they're safe, if they're still laughing and playing despite everything they've been through. I can't regret actions that protected innocent lives, but it changed your entire career path. Maybe that needed to happen. I spent 3 years flying combat missions thinking that following orders and completing objectives was enough. But that day showed me that sometimes we have to do more than just follow orders. Sometimes we have to think about why those orders exist in the first place." That afternoon, Sarah led the pilots through a practical exercise using flight simulators. They faced scenarios similar to her convoy incident, practicing the decision-making process and tactical options she had developed. Major Park, who had been skeptical that morning, successfully navigated a complex scenario involving enemy fighters using a school as a base of operations. Using modified communications tactics and coordinated maneuvering, he separated the children from the hostile forces without firing a shot. "That was actually pretty effective," he admitted after the simulation ended. "I can see how these methods could save lives in real situations." As the training day concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Wilson approached Sarah with final thoughts. "Captain, when I first heard about your case, I thought you were a pilot who had gotten lucky with an unorthodox approach. But after today, I understand that you've developed a systematic method for handling impossible situations. Sir, the methods only work because they're based on understanding that civilians aren't just obstacles to military objectives. They're the reason we're fighting in the first place." 3 weeks later, Sarah received a letter from Emma that had been forwarded from her previous base. Her daughter had drawn a picture of a helicopter with musical notes coming out of it, surrounded by smiling children. At the bottom, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, Emma had written, "My mom protects kids like me." Sarah pinned the drawing to the wall of her new office, next to maps showing deployment locations for pilots trained in the new procedures. In the months since the program had begun, there had been a measurable decrease in civilian casualties during air operations, and several successful missions where modified tactics had achieved objectives that traditional approaches had failed to accomplish. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Colonel Rodriguez from Afghanistan. "Sarah, I wanted to give you an update on something you might find interesting. Remember that convoy you engaged 6 months ago?" "Of course, sir. Intelligence has been tracking the aftermath. The children from that village have been attending a new school, built by international aid organizations. Apparently, they tell other kids about the day American helicopters played music and protected them from bad men." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "Sir, are they safe?" "As safe as anyone can be in that region." "But Sarah, here's the interesting part. Recruitment for insurgent groups in that area has dropped significantly. The local population is more cooperative with coalition forces. Your actions that day didn't just save lives. They may have changed hearts and minds in ways we're still discovering." After the call ended, Sarah looked again at Emma's drawing. The sound of children's laughter, both from that day in Afghanistan and from her weekly calls home, no longer carried the weight of difficult memories. Instead, it represented the possibility that military service could be about more than just following orders and completing missions. Outside her window, she could hear Apache helicopters conducting training flights with the next group of pilots who would learn to think beyond traditional tactics. Each of them would face their own impossible situations. Their own moments when choosing between safety and duty would define not just their careers but their character. The war continued, and there would always be new challenges, new situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. But now there were better tools, better procedures, and better understanding of what it meant to serve with honor while protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The laughter of children, distant but clear, echoed in her memory as a reminder of why some risks were worth taking and why some rules were worth changing. Sarah Mitchell had ambushed convention and found something better than orders. She had found purpose.